Okay, these are your video notes for today. Hello, here's your camera. This is the Road to Revolution, 1763 to 1775. Be prepared for a two-question quiz on this material when you come into class tomorrow. Here we go. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about some of these tax laws, and as you can imagine, based on what we talked about with the Stamp Act at the end of last week, there's a lot of frustration on the colonists' part with these taxes. The Stamp Act, which we looked at 3 documents related to, provokes a lot of resistance on the part of the colonists. There are boycotts organized by a new group called the Sons of Liberty, who are also going to refer to themselves as the Patriots. In another couple of years, maybe this is who a certain football team is named after in New England. There's going to be something called the non-importation movement. That's also a way of hurting England economically. If you boycott something, it means that you're not going to buy it or participate in it. The non-importation movement, which is done by women in the home, is another form of this. It says they're not going to buy things that have to be imported. They're going to make their own. So instead of buying English cloth, the Daughters of Liberty are going to learn how to weave their own cloth. And maybe it won't be as nice, but they won't be paying England in order to make clothing for their family anymore. And this works. The colonists' reactions against the Stamp Act actually, and their argument that that this is not a legal tax, it works. Parliament repeals the act in 1766, so about a year after it's gone into effect. They do pass another act called the Declaratory Act, saying that they are still in control in the colonies, and the colonies had better watch it or else. But it's not an additional tax at this time. And this image is just to kind of give you an example of what one of these stamps look like. It's not like a postage stamp like we see today when you're mailing a letter. It's almost more like an embossed 3-dimensional stamp on the corner of a page of paper. So the colonists are feeling pretty good after the Stamp Act. But England is not feeling so good because the whole point of this was to raise money. So England very quickly passes a series of new taxation laws called the Townsend Acts. So in 1767, these are really meant to reassert Parliament's power, but they're also going to raise money that's meant to support the civil government according to Parliament in the colonies. So paying for things like the soldiers that are going to be there after the war, the new courts that are going to be in place. The Townsend Acts are going to apply to all sorts of goods that the colonists import on a regular basis. So glass, tea, paper, paint, and lead that would be used to make things like this pewter drinking glass. Most of the colonists' plates and dishes and things like that at this time were either made out of ceramics or pewter. So these are all things, everyday household goods, and there's going to be a little additional tax on each of them. So the victory that the colonists may have been feeling about avoiding some of these taxes is pretty short-lived. There's also going to be some kind of violent clashes over some of these laws moving forward. There's an important event called the Boston Massacre that happens a couple years after the Townsend Acts are put into place. There have been protests, there have been more kind of mob reactions against the Townsend Acts, and so troops have been sent to Boston and other parts of the colonies as well to try to put down some of this violence. On March 5th of 1770, British soldiers open fire on an unruly crowd that is sort of attacking them and provoking them in Boston. It's possible that the colonists were throwing snowballs. It's possible that the snowballs had rocks in them. It's also a lot of confusion. It's not clear who gave the order to fire. It might have actually been one of the colonists. It may have been one of the soldiers. What we know is that when the smoke clears, you have a bunch of British troops pointing smoking guns at a group of colonists, and 5 colonists have died and are bleeding in the snow on Boston Common. This is 5 people, which is a tragedy, but it's not like an entire town was taken out. But the newspapers in New England and other parts of the colonies are going to start referring to this as a massacre in order to kind of drum up some support for the idea that these British troops have to be stopped. The soldiers are sent to trial, but they're found innocent, and so the protests continue, which may sound kind of similar to some things that are in the news right now, if you're kind of paying attention to current events in this country. So it's not really a massacre, but it becomes this moment where average everyday colonists who maybe weren't very in favor of independence or even considering it are maybe thinking, I'm not sure these British soldiers are here to protect my best interests. What if I'm next? And so it starts to tip more people towards the idea that rebellion and revolution is going to be the only way to permanently solve some of these issues with Great Britain. It also helps that Paul Revere, he of the Midnight Ride to warn the American colonists that the British are coming in another couple years. He's a talented guy. He's a silversmith. He may have made Washington a pair of teeth, but he also makes this engraving of the scene. And definitely, if you see this in a local newspaper, this looks incredibly intentional. It looks like the British troops are really trying to hurt the colonists who are over here kind of in disarray. So the power of the media was definitely something that people were aware of in colonial times just as much as they are today. Poor Boston. So Boston has the Boston Massacre. Tensions between the colonists and Great Britain do not lessen. And then in 1773, England tries again to raise some money to pay down that debt following the 7 Years' War by passing another taxation law. The Tea Act, which is passed in 1773, is meant to do a couple things. It's supposed to help a company, a tea company in England called the British East India Company. They have all this tea sitting around, bushels and barrels of tea, boxes full of tea that people aren't buying because Dutch tea is cheaper. So this company is losing money, and essentially the Tea Act gives the British East India Company a loan, and they don't have to pay taxes on their tea. So the tax amount on the tea actually decreases. This is meant to try to incentivize the colonists, try to get them to actually buy some of this tea, because it makes it much cheaper than the illegal smuggled tea from the Netherlands that people had been drinking. But the colonists see through this, and they, at this point, kind of make this pivot. Most of the frustration and the protests about the Stamp Act and the Townsend Act had been because they cost people money. This was actually making things cheaper for them, but the colonists at this point said, this is a matter of principle. This is not just about our money. This is about the idea of who is making these laws and why our voices are not being heard. So on the evening of December 16th in 1773, colonists disguised themselves and climbed on board to these ships floating in the Boston harbor and threw all of the tea overboard. It was about $9,000 worth of tea, which maybe doesn't sound like that much, but that would be almost $2 million in 2014, about 1.7 million US dollars. And once the tea goes into the water, it's not like you can get it back out again. So that's basically taking $1.7 million and just lighting it on fire. We actually have accounts that some of the people who tried to sneak some tea off the ship with them were stopped by the other Sons of Liberty and were forced to dump that tea, because this was about the principle of the thing and not about getting cheaper tea. So we have another engraving from the time period. You can see that here's the ship with the boxes of tea being thrown overboard and cheered by crowds who are on the wharves here of the harbor. Now, you might look at this and think, well, these are clearly Native Americans who are dumping the tea overboard. This was a disguise that was chosen by the Sons of Liberty as they were doing this, not because they didn't think that people couldn't tell who they were. This wasn't to disguise their identities and make them anonymous. Everyone knew exactly who was dumping the tea. But this was another kind of symbol to the British. Mohawk Indians had been enemies of the British in the French and Indian War and had kind of become the symbol for the colonists, people who had really stood up for their freedom and their liberty. So this is a pretty strong message to the British government that this is not about economics, this is not about taxes, this is really a question of freedom. And at this point, the colonists are expressing that their freedoms are being taken away by the crown. Of course, Parliament can't just let this happen and not do anything about it. So they respond with another series of laws called the Coercive Acts, meaning that they're meant to coerce Boston into doing certain things, into behaving, essentially. But the colonists sometimes refer to these laws as the Intolerable Acts because they're just so strict. They cannot be tolerated by patriots any longer. What some of these laws do is they close Boston Harbor, which is a huge economic blow to the city of Boston and all of New England. This is one of the biggest ports in the world, really, at this point, and it's completely shut down. They also end up suspending local government, so local town hall meetings that had gone all the way back to the time that the first Puritans were arriving in New England. Those no longer get to meet or pass laws. The charter of Massachusetts is revoked, so it becomes a royal colony instead of a colony that was sort of governed by the people who lived there. So this is a big issue. For many colonists, this is the breaking point. So in response to this, a couple of delegates are called together from all over the colonies, and they meet to try to figure out what are they going to do about this. The Continental Congress has an earlier model. After the Stamp Act, there was a Stamp Act Congress where all the delegates get together and decide how to have a boycott and how to have a organized mob response to something. In this case, they are trying to figure out how do they both help Boston, how do they organize new boycotts that would maybe hurt England, and how can they get their voices heard in Parliament so that they have some input into making these laws. So the delegates are the representatives from every colony. 12 of the colonies are able to send them. Georgia is a royal governor, royal colony at this point, so they are not allowed to send a representative to the First Continental Congress. They adopt a new renewed boycott. They encourage colonists as well to form local militias. So find a group of people who you can stand up to the British again, like with, if you need to, if push comes to shove. And they actually write a letter to the king, appealing him to think about how their representation in Parliament might be changed, sort of begging him to kind of go back to the way things had been before the end of the French and Indian War and the end of salutary neglect, and they're rejected. He writes back, "The New England governments are in a state of rebellion and blows must decide." So he is ready to take it to a violent place. He's not ready to compromise anymore. Just to give you a sense of how much this must have been wearing on King George, this is King George in 1757. So right during the time of the 7 Years' War, he's young. He's 27 years old. He's, maybe looks a little different from a hip 27-year-olds of today. But you can see he's young, he's vital, he's got color in his cheeks. 6 years go by, and by the time we're kind of at the spot on our timeline where we are right now, right before a violent conflict is about to break out in the colonies, a new portrait is painted, and the king at the ripe old age of 33, which is 1 year younger than I am, looks like this. Ugh, hard to be the king during this period. So these frustrations and these tensions, they're mounting throughout this entire time period. They're coming to a head. And later this week, we'll talk about what those first conflicts are and what will become the American War for Independence. Hope your notes are good. Get ready for your quiz at the beginning of our next class.